This is July 1, 2014. Kevin Miller. I'm interviewing my father, David I. Miller. Can you tell us about your memory of your father, Ivan J. Miller, being ordained, or what's the proper term, being selected for ordination?
Yeah, he was ordained as a minister in the church. It was been at the Maple Glen Church, not the building that's there now, but the previous building. And so the practice of the church was to have a bench of ministers, a plural ministry, and often as the ministers were aging, they'd say it's time to get another minister into the ranks, and the method for doing that was to simply have the church vote for a man without any nominations offered. The church body just simply voted. The way of voting was for the people, the members of the church, to come, the ministers, the bishop in charge, and other ministers with him would go to the anteroom in the front of the church, and people were invited to come out there one at a time or a couple of times. Actually, back in those days, it was one at a time. The men sat on one side of the aisle and the women on the other. And so the husbands and wives would not have gone out together, but men and women both would go to give their vote. It wasn't expected that everybody goes necessarily, but those who felt they had a name to offer would go to the anteroom and offer that name.
So when you say vote, you're using that term loosely. You mean a nomination?
Yeah, that's right. That is true. It would have been offering a nomination without any previous nominations given from which to vote. And so they would go, and the ministers there would receive the name you had to offer, and that would be recorded. And I even have copies of tally sheets that were done in ordinations where a name was written down, then when another person came with the same name, just a mark, and so on. So that would register even how many votes each had. Then the practice was that any man that had 3 or more votes would be placed into the lot. And to be in the lot meant that you now were a candidate, but to be chosen by the lot.
How many people usually would end up in the lot?
I know of cases where there were 2, of cases where there were 3, of cases where there were 5, cases were up to 7, and it could be more, but not very often was it more than 7 that I'm aware of. And so once a lot was announced, in those early days when my father was ordained in 1938, it all happened in one morning. They went to church and they received the votes, the nominations, and the lot was announced, who was in the lot. And then the interview, I'm not sure if there's even a private interview with any of the ministers, but the bishop did ask questions, including the question, are you willing to receive this call if you are chosen by the Lord?
Was that question asked publicly, or was that asked in the anteroom privately?
I believe in 1938 it was asked publicly. And then the bishop also would ask the candidate's wife, or each man in the lot, each wife, are you willing for your husband to accept this? As it happened when my father's ordination, it was his father-in-law, Christian Bender, that was the bishop in charge. And he forgot to ask the candidate's wife, are you willing to accept this?
And who was the candidate's wife?
The candidate's wife was his daughter, Della. And later he apologized to her for having forgotten that. And so in the case of my father's ordination, I happen to know who was in the lot. It was Alvin Yoder, Evan Miller, Floyd Miller. Evan and Floyd both were brothers of Ivan. And so those two brothers and Alvin Yoder and Simon Beachy and my father, that's five, I think, were in the lot. And so my father then drew the book that had the lot. He told me once that he had no guidance, no leaning as to which book to take. He was the youngest of the five, and so he decided he'd just wait and let the others take the book, and he takes what's left. And so he did. And I was 5 years old then. And I recall sitting on a bench. Well, the benches there were arranged like what's often known as the Amen corner, with the benches going the long way of the building, of the auditorium, the sanctuary. And so the candidates were then, those in the lot were placed on the front of those long benches up front in the corner. And somehow I must have been relegated then. My father got involved that way to sit with somebody, probably some uncle, I don't know who it was. And I was situated right behind where my father was seated. I couldn't figure out what they're doing to my father. His neck was all red, and there's something very somber going on, and I really had no idea what it was. You see, my parents went to church not knowing what's going to happen either. And
so they didn't prepare you for this because
they
didn't know.
Apparently they did not prepare me for it, because it would have been presumptuous to almost for my father to say I might be in the lot today or I might be ordained today. That would have been presumptuous. In fact, to seek to be a minister was considered presumptuous. That's a place too high a honor or too sacred a calling to assume that the church would call you to that the Lord would call you through the church. So then after the ordination, as custom was, when there was something special, often people would go to somebody's house for noon meal, and so just lots of people went to my parents' home for the Sunday noon meal that day. And our whole practice of hospitality was such that you didn't depend on invitations, you just went. If you got the notion to go to somebody's house for Sunday noon dinner, you went. And everybody just accepted that, and then you also were in a position to receive guests that way as well as to go to be a guest.
Was there some unspoken clue or understanding that this house was one you could go to, but this house wasn't hosting?
It wasn't a very clear thing. It might have been a little easier to go to a relative's house. And what sometimes happened was the family might decide, let's go to this place. And when they approached the place, they saw a number of cars parked there. So they went on because they thought they've got enough now. So things like that were happening. And it tended to be, too, if our church service was one congregation with 3 meeting houses. We met at Maple Glen, which was central one Sunday, Oakdale, Cherry Glade the other Sunday, then Maple Glen, then Oakdale, Cherry Glade, back and forth. And if we went from Grantsville to Oakdale, it was easier we tend to go to an Oakdale area family for dinner if you went somewhere. If you were at Maple Glen, you tended more to go home because you might be getting company. It wasn't strictly that way. Maple Glenners could go to Maple Glenners, but it tended not to happen quite so much, I think. But in this case then, I guess everybody's very sympathetic with Ivan and Della because he'd been called to the ministry, and this was a case where there was not education for it or special preparation for it. And it was seen as a high calling, but also as a great burden. And as a very tearful kind of thing, actually, when it was known who the lot fell on, as the term was used. But must have been a lot of people that went to my parents' house for Sunday dinner, because I remember when we drove down the lane that we didn't even drive on down to the buildings. We parked up close to the that windbreak there at Mapleshade Farm because it was parked with cars down through. And then as we got off the car and we walked down the lane into the lawn, then one of my cousins was there on the lawn, and I think it was Miriam Most or Catherine Most, maybe. I'm not sure which one now, daughters of Alan and Alma Most. And one of them said to me, "Bist du froh, dass dein Papa a Brediger is? Are you glad that your father's a minister?" Then the light dawned. I knew what happened.
That was the moment where you understood?
Yes. That's the moment when I knew what happened. And actually, on the way home, I think my parents were not they were burdened and emotional and not talking much, and so I can understand that. So that's a little bit the memory I have of that. And any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, can you step back now with your theological training and your Anabaptist history and theology in particular, and say, what is the lot? Where did that idea come from? Does it go back to the early Anabaptists? Is there some kind of scriptural basis for it that was drawn upon to?
Well, talking about scriptural basis, the thing that I've heard most frequently was in Acts 2, where the apostles chose Matthias by the lot to take Judas's place. And of course, some people say that is not valid. They did it before the Holy Spirit was given. They should have waited. And that Paul was supposed to be that apostle, not Matthias. And I'm not so sure about all that. But that would be the main scriptural basis for it. Another, dynamic or sociological basis would be the fact that the lot does save quarrels, as it says in Proverbs. And if you believe that the lot is God's way of making a choice, then you can't argue with where the lot fell, if you believe that.
It takes some of the determinism out of the process of selection.
It does.
There's more chance, we would say, or providence, I guess, is how.
That's true. And like there at Maple Glen, when my father was ordained, talk about the preacher's bench. His father was a minister on the preacher's bench. His father-in-law was a bishop on the preacher's bench. And for them to have come to the congregation and say, "We propose that Ivan Miller be ordained to join the ministerial team," could have looked like nepotism. But if it's done through the lot, you can't argue. I mean, and that was the accepted way in the congregation and the conference and throughout much of the Mennonite world, not so much the General Conference Mennonites or the Russian, but throughout the East there, that was the accepted way to select a man for ordination back in 1938.
And the Old Order Amish.
And the Old Order Amish, definitely. The Old Order Amish wouldn't do it any other way. And the Beachy Amish, it was very solidly the practice, perhaps yet, but they ran into a problem when they started doing mission work. And so they had work in Berlin, Germany after World War II. And they decided they need to have a minister there, an ordained minister for that work. And they thoroughly believed that the use of the lot is a way to make that selection. So what do we do now? How do we handle this? My uncle Harvey Miller was a missionary, not with the Beachy Amish, but with our conference in the Eastern Board. And he was sort of involved in a lot of consultation places like that. And he suggested to them, why wouldn't you invite people throughout your Beachy Fellowship to offer a name and see what names seem to come out of this throughout the Beachy Fellowship. And then you have a meeting where these all come together and you can use a lot to make a choice. And that's what they did. They had two men in the lot. One was Louis Overholt, who was already in Germany for some years. And the other, I don't remember who the other one was now, but Lewis overhauled through the lot, and he was the one who was already there, and then he had a long service there as a result of that, and the pastoral ministry there. Well, that just demonstrates how thoroughly the lot was ingrained in our thinking, and it took. There are many cases where father, son were in the ministerial team and brothers, and in this case, you had 3 brothers in the lot when my father was ordained. Then he was joining the preacher's bench with his father-in-law. Before that, his grandfather, Miller, was the bishop. And so it could have looked like a nepotism without the use of the lot. And so that was just thoroughly ingrained, actually. The history of the lot. There was a conference of Anabaptists, and this might have been the Amish branch, if I'm not mistaken, in Europe. And this was perhaps in the early 1700s. I'm not sure when it was. Can't remember which location it was, where there was an assembly where they came up with some guidelines for themselves, and they said ministers are to be chosen by lot. Also,
was that written down?
Yes, that's written down. I could fish that out of the history somewhere there to find that. I can't remember just where it is now.
Was it written in a book, or was it just oral history?
No, it's written. It's a written document. I don't know if it's in a book, but it's like the Mennonite Quarterly Review would have it, I believe. And
but I mean, it wasn't one of the Amish ministerial books that have been used for generations.
No, I don't think it was that. It was not something that was that much circulated in a popular way, probably. But nonetheless, it was an official position taken by that particular group of people. But not all of them were. But I don't think use of the lot doesn't go back to the 1500s. Not that I know of. But one thing that was early, though, and that I think contributed to this, was there was an early position of the Anabaptists that in the days of persecution, if a shepherd, a pastor, is taken away, is persecuted or is martyred or is removed from them, put into prison, that the leadership of the closest neighboring congregation is to give leadership to the congregation to choose another minister. And it was urgent for them to have a way to get a minister chosen. And also the baptismal vows included for the boys, the men, a commitment that if the Lord calls you through the church to the ministry, will you accept this? The answer was yes. And the girls, the women, promised in case of her being married to a man who's called, will she support this? Yes. And so there was a great need there to come up with pastors quick in those days of persecution. And sometimes I think of it, how simple it used to be to get a minister compared to what it is now, where you have to have a search committee and you have to go through all this processing. And
the candidates often now need to have a degree, right?
In some places. In some places, a degree, and not in our conference, but in some places they do, and to a lot of interviewing and to do trial sermons and so on. Well, when my father was ordained, it all happened one morning, and he went to church not knowing what's going to happen, not unless the Lord told him. I don't think he did. He told me once that I think he thought someday he'd be ordained, but he didn't think it'd be then. And I can see that. He had 2 older brothers in the lot there. And so I can see why he might not have expected for himself to be the one at that point. So later then, years later, he was in 1990, he was ordained bishop then. And that's the same process of nominations, except that the nominations come from one of the ordained ministers of the preaching staff of the church. They are the possibilities.
But the bishop is still chosen through the process of the lot.
Yeah, the the church gives their nominations of one of the ministers. It might be all the ministers will be in the lot, and they might not be. But however the church comes through with its nominations, and then out of that, the lot is formed. When my father was named bishop, there were 3 ministers that were possibilities. There was Simon Beachy, who was deacon, but it was understood he would not be counted with that, I believe. And then the bishop himself was aged, and of course, so there were 3 ministers: Mark Peachy, Paul Yoder, and my dad. All 3 were in the lot. But my dad, he and my mother had gone down to the cabin in the woods for a time, almost a day of just meditation and so on, preparation for this. And he believed the Lord told him which book to take. He already knew then that the vote then was taken so that the lot was known a few days in advance. And he knew there'd be 3 books. He believed the Lord told him which book to take. He didn't know if the lot's there or not, but he just knew which book to take. So when time came to take the book, he was the first to come up and get a book and sit down, and that's where the lot was.
He didn't need to be first, but he felt he was ready.
Yeah, there's no order given as to when you... There have been times when the members all sat there quite a while before somebody got up.
What kind of book did they use, and what was the...
It was a hymn book. It was a hymn book, and identical hymn books. And then the bishop in charge would have those 3 books brought out. And then he would instruct somebody to take these 3 books out into the anteroom and put them out there on a stack, or I don't know, I guess a stack, and to come back in. Then he'd send somebody else out to shuffle the books. And then he'd come back in. Then he'd send somebody else out to bring the books in and lay them out on the table. So there's no way anybody could know where that slip of paper is.
Or engineer.
And there was a slip of paper in there that had a quotation from Proverbs. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposal thereof is of the Lord.
Oh.
Maybe not the whole disposal, but the disposal thereof is of the Lord. And that was what was in the older ones in the German language also. Like back when my father was ordained, it would have been that in German.
Do you think the lot was used in Germany before the Amish Mennonites came to?
Yes, I'm confident it was, because for one thing, that conference that says the lot is to be used, that was in Germany. What I don't for sure know is how widespread it was in Germany. There was that one group that said that, and that's what caught on. And that's pretty well what seems to have been brought to America. And throughout all the Amish Mennonite groups, it was the lot, so far as I know. I don't know of any exceptions. And among the Mennonites, the Lancaster Conference, what is today, what's sometimes called Old Mennonite, that was pretty well standard throughout the whole thing. But I don't think it was among the General Conference Mennonites then. They had split off from the other Mennonites back in the mid-1800s, and they had made some changes away from some of the ordinances, like feet washing and concern about dress and things like that. They'd made some, what the other Mennonites call very worldly kinds of changes. And I don't think that they continued the use of the lot. I'm not real sure about that. But it was very widespread. In our conference then, the beginning of not using the lot, so far as I know, the first man to be ordained without the lot was Andrew Jancey, when he was sent to Flint, Michigan, to be a pastor there. And
what year?
In the 1940s. I'm guessing 44, 43, 44, 45.
And that wasn't a typical ordination because it was a mission setting.
Yeah, right. And so how do you process this then with Andrew? He was already there, I believe, as a superintendent maybe or something like that. But my grandpa Miller, J.B. Miller, he was very much opposed to that. He never approved to do this kind of thing without the lot.
Let's stop there. How did he express, or in what venue did he state his disapproval?
I just happened to know that because of hearing my father say so,
Okay.
that he was opposed to it. Whether I don't think he put anything in writing that, I think I could find letters of his that express that. I believe I could. I doubt that he published anything directly addressing that situation.
Did your father say why J.B. Miller thought it was a bad idea?
I don't know. I don't remember that he did.
What do you think would be the reason?
I think it was, I think he just saw the whole process of degenerating into favoritism and away from the Lord's call, and it just takes that supernatural element out of the choice, and I think it was that kind of thing, as well as he tended to be quite concerned about a lot of changes, or the kind of changes that seem to be adrift from an Amish Mennonitism into not just Mennonitism but Protestantism and so on, and it's partly related to that. He was a very strong advocate of being Amish Mennonite. He wrote some pretty strong things about, well, the name of the conference. He gave speeches at least one speech at conference where he emphasized that the name is Amish Mennonite, Conservative Amish Mennonite Conference, and no one unauthorized has any right to change that name. He's very strong on, and he wanted to retain the Amishness of the Amish part of Mennonitism. He was very concerned about that.
Was he alive in 1954 when the conference dropped the word Amish from its name?
No, he had died. He died in 52. He died in 52, I believe. So he would not have been alive then. But he would have been thoroughly opposed to it if he'd have had a chance to speak to it. He would have thoroughly opposed it.
Let's end with your thoughts on what do you think has been lost with the new way we select ministers and not using the lot?
Well, I don't know if anything's been lost. If something has been lost, it might be there's not there used to be more of a almost given respect for the office of minister, where it's now more seen on the level of other professions, where back then our men weren't going into other professions much. That was one place where you could be a professional almost. And so it had us, even though you were supposed to be one among the brothers, and you were, in my dad's day, you were bivocational, and you weren't supported by the church.
Were you paid for being a minister?
Was I?
I mean, was the ordained minister chosen by lot paid for his role?
Not back then. When my father was ordained, he was not paid. In fact, he told me the story once that his neighbor, Alvin Yoder, who was in the lot but was not chosen, he came to him and just wanted to give him a gift soon after the ordination. And I guess a gift of support and so on. And my dad refused to accept it. And so Alvin walked away from him with the check in his hand. And my dad said to him, I want you to know what's happening with this check, and just went and laid it on the post and walked away from it. And the idea was you pay a minister and he's bound to the payer's wishes. That was the idea. But I think there's another angle to it. I think sometimes then also the minister did not have a sense of accountability to the congregation. And there weren't any elders, no church council. It was simply who was ordained and was on the ministerial team there in that way. And I think my father and my grandfathers, my father had some of that later on then, but they could have profited with something like elders that rotate, sort of mediate. There were times when there were tensions within the ministerial body, and having that little outside help from the congregation, especially on a rotating basis where it brings fresh blood in once in a while, I think that could have helped in certain situations. So I think there's the use of the lot. I used to think growing up that the lot really worked because it gave us excellent preachers. I thought we had top-notch preachers, and all of our preachers were used by other congregations. J.B. Miller did a lot of traveling preaching in congregations, and C.W. Bender did a lot of travel, more in church administration as a bishop, perhaps more so than in preaching per se. And I didn't admire my Grandpa Bender's preaching as much as my Grandpa Miller's. As a boy, I used to sit there and just really admire Grandpa's preaching. He had such wonderful English style and such a colorful vocabulary and such an extensive vocabulary. And his diction was so distinct and in English, when many of his peers were Dutchified in their English, you know. And so I thought, well, that worked, I guess. And Shem Peachy was a great man. He was widely used throughout the conference and other churches as a preacher. Mark Peachy. I just thought the lot really produces good preachers. But there are plenty of other cases I learned to know that the lot produced not so good preachers, and they didn't even last in some cases. So I just don't think you can go to the scriptures and insist on the lot. You can accommodate it, I think, in some situations, but I don't think it's something the New Testament calls for as such. It might accommodate it more than it calls for it.
Thank you.